Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa man wala. Syada la ilaha illallah, syada Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Allahumma salli ala sayidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Alhamdulillah, all praise and gratitude to Allah Subhanahu wa taala, segala pujian dan juga kesyukuran kepada Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Pada hari ini saya Fazrul Ismail bersama dengan tuan-tuan dalam program Intro to Islamic Management. Dan insyaAllah kita akan bersama dengan tetamu undangan kita pada hari ini yang amat istimewa, iaitu Dr. Ridhwan Fontaine. Ya, Assalamualaikum Dr. Ridhwan.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alhamdulillah, you can clear, right?
Yes, no problem.
Alhamdulillah. So we welcome our audience to our program today, Intro to Islamic Management, and what we will discuss today from Academy SNIJI, we want to introduce the expert in management, a professor in IIUM, University Islam Antarabangsa, Dr. Ridhwan Fontaine. So while we are waiting for maybe another 20 seconds, I would like to introduce on how I get to know Dr. Ridhwan beforehand. I think I know him for quite a long time since when Dr. Ridhwan taught in MMU in Sabarjaya, and at that time the topic that we get together is about system thinking, and that is my first book when I wrote in 2003 when I was in the United States, and I went to Egypt. I delivered a speech on system thinking. I'm interested. I really like the topic because that is among the final year project, and also in how to integrate the knowledge between West and East and West and East. So when I get back to Malaysia, I get to know somebody who are really into system thinking, which is Dr. Ridhwan. So today, I would like to invite Dr. Ridhwan to share about the latest finding or latest research, latest book he's writing, authoring, and will be published soon, inshallah. The manuscript is done under editing, and perhaps today we have about hour. So about 30 minutes, we will, inshallah, listen from what have been listen from Dr. Ridhwan, and then after that, question and answer. So if you have any question, you can just post on the comment on YouTube or on Facebook, and inshallah by 2 or by 3, inshallah we'll get the question across, and Dr. Ridhwan will address it, inshallah. So without any further, I would like to invite Dr. Ridhwan to at the first round, maybe if you can introduce yourself, your experience, and also people would also want to know more about your background, especially when we have Fontaine, your last name,
Yes.
and Ridhwan as your first name. Please,
Yes.
Doctor.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. First of all, this is still a very new experience to me. So if I look uncomfortable, it is because I'm uncomfortable. My full name is Rodrigue Ancelot Hervé Fontaine. I am half French, half English. I converted to Islam when I was 23. I converted in the UK. I did not convert in order to get married. That's normally one of the questions that people always have at the back of their mind. I converted to Islam simply because I read the English translation of the Quran, and it became very clear to me that this could not be anything except revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that was in 1993. Then I moved to Malaysia in 1999. I started teaching management in MMU. And in 2004, I finished my PhD. But by then, I had already decided that I was bored with doing the topic of PhD that I was doing, which was cross-cultural management. And so I decided in 2004, I'm going to focus on Islamic management. And the first thing that I did is ask myself the question, is Islamic management a reality, or is it just something that exists in our imagination? And so I went around talking to different people in KL, mostly CEOs. The majority of them were Malays. The majority of them were owners of small businesses. And I realized very quickly that Islamic management was a reality, but nobody has documented it. And there's not really a theoretical model that people had been working with. So every entrepreneur basically who was interested in Islam was kind of doing their own thing and having their own interpretation of Islamic management. So then I moved to UAE in 2010, and then I started doing essentially working full-time on Islamic management. And what I decided to do is to look at empirical data. In other words, I'm not interested in a purely theoretical understanding of Islamic management where you just look at a few ayat of Quran or a few hadith. What I wanted to do is do experiments with my students. For example, give them ayat of Quran or hadith, but see what is the impact that it has on their perception. How does it change their behavior? How does it change their attitude, right? And how is it possible to develop processes so that in the context of an organization, you can have HR policies or policies that are initiated at the top management level so that the organization can transform itself and embrace Islamic management. So I want to emphasize, I'm not an ustaz. I know just a little bit about Islam. I am a management person. I believe in processes. And I would say I'm very much interested in psychology. So virtually all of my experiments that I've done with my students has to do with basically psychological experiments. The data that I've collected over the years, so since 2010, I've collected over 3,000 points of data with over 3,000 students. My overall conclusion was, number one, it is very easy and very cost-effective to develop Muslims who internalize the values of the Quran and Sunnah. Okay, it's easy, it's cost-effective, but it takes time. So it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be more a coaching process rather than you attend a simple workshop. But the data is without doubt. And a lot of my students are just normal, ordinary Malaysians. A lot of my students are also MBA students, so they're working full-time, and they're just doing their MBA part-time. I've done this almost every semester for the last 10 years, so I'm very, very comfortable with the data. And one of my motivation of working with Academic Synergy is to see, okay, I've done this with my students. Is it possible to bring this to the corporate world? And really, this is what I'm interested in about. I have developed a theoretical model that satisfies the norm of academic discipline. Alhamdulillah, that's better than nothing. Now what I want to do is try to work with people from the corporate sector, get feedback, and see, is this model practical for them? And obviously, I'm not in a position to do that because I do have some contacts with the corporate sector, but not a lot. And this is where, alhamdulillah, someone like Tuan Fazrul can really help me, not just in spreading the message to people who are interested in Islamic management, but also kind of getting collaborations. And so that's what I'm really working, really interested in. Is it possible to have a look at the PowerPoint slides?
Okay, so I will share the PowerPoint from my side. This is
Okay.
produced by Dr. Ridhwan.
Okay.
So we'll see here. Okay. All right.
Okay. Okay. So here, the first slide is really important. Quranic thinking. Essentially, a lot of what has happened because of the environment in Malaysia, which is kind of a combination of Islamic plus secular environment, a lot of Muslims actually do not have what I call Quranic thinking. So the way that they see the world is not aligned to the Quran. They're Muslims, they're sincere, but there's so many things that they do not understand about the Quran. So for me, the basis of Islamic management is really getting Muslims to understand and see the way they see the world through the eyes of the Quran. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the empirical model. One of the things I want to say about this empirical model is, as I have done research over the last 10 years, I started by assuming that Muslims needed to know a lot about the Quran and the Sunnah to be good Muslims. And now I've realized that is completely not true. You only need to know a little bit. But what you need to know, you need to think about deeply. So you need to really get into this culture of tadabbur. So for example, with my students at the moment, I focus on Surah Al-Fatiha. I get my students to think about Surah Al-Fatiha every single day. Literally, as you live your life, you should link whatever you're doing to insights from Surah Al-Fatiha. And when my students do this for the first time, it's like, they don't know why do I ask them? It's like so simple. Surah Al-Fatiha is just 7 ayat. But by the end of the semester, the way they see the world has changed, because that is the power of Surah Al-Fatiha. It is literally a summary of the whole Quran. Okay, so this idea of tadabbur is very, very, very powerful. The second thing is conventional management doesn't work very well. And the biggest problem in the way we think about management at the moment, it's greed. And I was just thinking about this earlier. The way the coronavirus has completely destroyed entire parts of our industry is absolutely amazing. And I mean, we are in the middle of the coronavirus outbreak, so it's difficult to make a lot of comments. But I'm sure that when people look back at it in several years from now, they will see that one of the issues was a lot of people got greedy. Okay, so for example, one of the principles in Islamic management is you do not borrow money unnecessarily. If you want to grow your business, as much as possible, you rely on cash flow. You don't go and borrow money from the bank unnecessarily. So when you have a downturn like what is happening at the moment, all the companies that have got a lot of debt are in real big trouble. But those companies that have a minimum amount of debt and they have enough cash flow, inshallah, they will be able to weather the storm. Okay, this is something that I talked about in one of my books on Islamic management almost 7 years ago. Okay, and so there's so many things about conventional management that doesn't work well. And one of the arguments in favor of Islamic management is that it resolves the problem of conventional management. We think about management at the moment. Okay, the other thing that I really want to talk about is the values of the Quran and the Sunnah. We cannot just think about them outside of the Quran and the Sunnah. So one of the things that I've done is I've looked at Surah Baqarah in some detail. I've looked at Surah Al Imran in some detail, Surah An Nisa and Surah Al Ma'idah in some detail. And when I started looking at these values there, it's so powerful. It is so powerful, not just simply because we have the values, but we have the values in context, right? So this is something that I talk a lot about in the book that I've written, which inshallah will be published soon. I don't think it's possible to just talk about this like in a web seminar for 15, 20 minutes. But what I'm trying to say is, when we talk about Islamic values, we cannot talk them out of context. We have to, for example, do a little bit of a study of Surah Al-Baqarah and understand where do the values in Surah Al-Baqarah, where do they come from? And for example, what were the mistakes of Bani Israel, so that we do not repeat the mistakes of Bani Israel? When we do a little bit of a reading of Ali Imran, then we see what are the values that come from Al Imran, and so on and so forth. So it's not a difficult exercise, but the context is very important. If you just try to, some people, when they talk about values, they just list a series of values, but there's no context. So it becomes very difficult for people to really understand what these words actually mean. Tuan Fazul, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is the prophetic leadership model, which is basically the heart of the way I think about Islamic management at the moment. So to the left, you have internalizing the Quran and the Sunnah through a process of tadabbur. Then you have one box, which is systems thinking and growth mindset. For me, this is anything to do with change. So I want to talk about this for a couple of minutes. One of the things I talk about in the book that I've written with the help of a number of people is the importance of big data, right? We are living in the 21st century. For me, the prophetic leadership model is not looking to the past and staying in the past, is looking to the past, learning from the past, but then looking to the future. And in the 21st century, we have to think about big data. So for me, Islamic management includes how do we deal with modern technology? How do we deal with big data? How do we deal with things like blockchains, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth? And alhamdulillah, we have some Muslims who are experts in this area. So, part of it is it's not going to be a one-man show. It's going to be different people from different backgrounds will be able to help us with these problems. Conventional leadership competency is also a big issue. Just from personal observation, I think that when it comes to communication skills, we have major problems in organizations in Malaysia. In many cases, top management communicates very badly, and they do not create an opportunity for people at the lower level of the organization to share their concern. This Quranic thinking, this system skill, growth mindset, conventional leadership leads into effective meetings. For me, this is one of the criteria of management that I'm always interested in. Are your meetings effective or not? And whenever I talk to people in the corporate sector, the majority of them will say, actually, most meetings are very badly managed. They're not very effective. A lot of people come to meetings, they're not prepared. And very often, people don't really rely on facts. So people are making decisions, but there's no real data to back up their decisions. Sometimes people make decisions which completely contradict the Quran and the Sunnah. This is sometimes it's quite amazing. You will have people who start meetings reciting, sometimes doing zikr or starting or finishing with Surat Al-Asr, and everything that they talked about in the meeting completely contradicts the Quran and the Sunnah. But they say we want to have an Islamic identity. So you can see that there's so many confusion, which will require looking at the foundation, thinking, okay, what do we mean by the Quran and the Sunnah? How do we deal with change? How do we make sure that everybody in the organization has got a basic levels of competence? How do we make sure that our meetings are effective? Right? And then if we come to that stage where all of our meetings or the majority of our meetings are effective, then I think most of the management problems that we have can be solved quite easily. Okay, I will not have time to look at the next slide, But if we can go to the last slide, please. Tuan Fazul? Okay, great. So these are three conclusions which I talk about in the book, and which I think hopefully when we have this question and answer sessions we can talk about. First of all, for me, Islamic management is primarily about creating an Islamic corporate culture. Okay. Again, I don't think it's difficult. It's not necessarily cost expensive, but it does take some time, and top management has to put in place certain processes so that it's done in a systematic manner. Okay. So the second agenda is creating the right processes. And I can say it must start at the top. So in Islamic management, if the people at the top of the organization are not committed to Islamic values, it's going to be very difficult to deal with certain issues, right? So everybody is looking at the top to set the right example. Now, sometimes people get scared when you use the word Islamic management because they have a very high perception that this must be very difficult and so on and so forth. Believe me, you can start just with Surah Al-Fatiha. If everybody who is in a top management position reflects on Surah Al-Fatiha and thinks about the way they lead people with Surah Al-Fatiha in mind, you will realize that there will be a change in the way they deal with people. Okay, so it doesn't have to be difficult, but you need to put in place the right processes, and the people at the top of the management needs to be committed to, starting this adventure called Islamic management. The third point is Islamic management has to take into consideration new technologies such as big data and AI and other technologies. Now, I was very lucky because one of my close friends is a consultant who specializes in big data and AI. And what I've learned about big data and AI, it doesn't have to be complicated, right? Very often we are afraid of things that we don't understand, and words like big data and AI scares people. Actually, when you get down to it, it's not that difficult to understand, but it's again changing the mindset, realizing that we cannot ignore data. If we are in making important management decisions and we don't have reliable data to back up what we're doing, we're maybe not being responsible. Okay. And the last of the conclusion is my hope to work with practitioners in the future in order to test the model, to modify the model, and to hopefully make it happen in reality. So hopefully it was a very quick 25 minutes overview presentation, but maybe with your questions I would be able to add some more lights on the topics that you're interested in. I pass it back to you, Tuan Fazul.
Okay, thank you so much to Dr. Ridhwan Fontaine to share about the finding. Really brief just now, and what we saw about 3 points: creating an Islamic corporate culture. This is one of the important point. Besides creating the right processes to spread Islamic values inside the organization, and the third one, spread the latest management knowledge, big data and AI, artificial intelligence inside the organization. So perhaps before we open for the question, for those who want to ask question, please put in the comment box under the video for YouTube or Facebook. I would like to ask or to get more light about the first point, creating an Islamic corporate culture. If you can give one or two examples, how you want to see that the Islamic corporate culture is there in any organization, or it just like the camouflage or the only on the outer layer. When they, in the end of the meeting, we have Surah Al-Asr, but in reality, it is not.
Yeah.
So, what do you think
Okay.
about that?
Okay. First of all, I think we have to start with our understanding that the majority of people who are working are good people and sincere. Okay. So if I'm assuming that the majority of Muslims in Malaysia would be happy to work in an Islamic environment, right? As long as you show to them that it's practical, it's relevant, it's, you know, it enables them to solve their problems, I don't think they have any issues. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I have tested this with my students. As I said, over 3,000 students. A lot of them were full-time working employees. What happens when you start developing this thing, at the beginning, nobody will really believe that it's possible because it seems very idealistic. And what I get them to do is generally I get them to watch one Islamic video every week, just keep a diary. There's another experiment which I've done, which is to take a hadith and get them to reflect on that hadith. So if I can take, for example, there was one MBA student that I was teaching, and I gave the assignment, look at whether you break your promises with your colleagues. And I used one of the hadith on the basis of that experiment. And as the semester progressed, she realized that half the time, the promises that she was making were broken. But she was breaking these promises to her colleagues without even realizing it. She was, you know, just we make promises to one another very casually. Yeah, inshallah, I will do that, and then you forget about it the 5 minutes later. So when she became aware of that, she became very, very careful in making promises to colleagues. But she also, if she did make a promise, she would work really, really, really hard to keep those promises. And as the semester progressed, she told me in her final report of her assignment that she realized that the level of trust between her and her colleagues increased very substantially. Now, the point with this little story is, if I had told her, if you think about it, you probably break your promises most of the time, she would have been very defensive. Okay, so you need to create a system where she realizes by her own self that she is the one who's making certain mistakes. And then she is able to correct herself. And you, as the person who is trying to develop her, you encourage her self-reflections, you encourage and her progress. You don't make sarcastic comments about, oh, why is it in the past you were breaking your you don't do that. You're helping her progress. So it is literally one Islamic video at a time. A lot of the Islamic videos that I encourage my students to watch are related to tafsir of Quran. So I ask a lot of them to watch, for example, Numan Ali Khan, because that's a speaker that everybody likes. Some people like to listen to Dr. Yasir Qadi. Most of my students speak English quite well, so they don't really rely so much on Malay speakers, but there are obviously some good Malay speakers. The point is, the way I ask them to do this, they're not just watching videos and then that's it. They're taking notes and they're trying to link the content of the videos to their day-to-day activities at work. Okay, so this is where tadabbur is very important. If you don't have that, it's like the process of tadabbur is almost, that is the magic circle. If you just having a lot of Islamic content but there's no tadabbur, it's like the learning cycle is broken.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ridhwan, to highlight about the journaling, watching the videos, and
Yeah.
then people, the student write it down and
Yeah.
try to audit themselves, right?
Yeah. Correct.
So it's been highlighted by one of our audience, Romy Sabihin. It says basically this is considered what we call literally a self audit. Is it
Correct.
true?
Correct.
Okay. So
Can I just make a point here?
yeah, please.
I've thought about this for a long time. Obviously, I've been working on this since 2004. One of the problems we have is we have trust issues with HR. So if HR is in charge of the process, everybody will become very, very defensive. So I'm very lucky in the sense that I'm in a education institution, so people don't have to be defensive with their lecture. So this issue of trust and what we call sometimes psychological safety is something that people have to figure out for this to work in the corporate world. But I think that it is still possible. But we cannot be naive. There are some issues with HR that you have to accept. This is reality.
Okay, thank you so much. So in when you relate this the activity with tadabbur, right?
Yeah.
So you write the latest book on Islamic management based on your tadabbur, observing or listening to the tafsir, trying to understand the
Yeah.
Quran. So what's the component in tadabbur that make us to have self audit or basically um, effective self audit, because self audit is basically being preached by many motivators or
Yeah.
management guru, but in terms of tadabbur, what's the component so that we if the audience would like to go for tadabbur, the component can be observed so that
Yeah.
we don't want another fad do tadabbur but the
Yeah.
component is lost, please.
Okay, so I will tell a little story. You probably remember, Tuan Fazrul, that I attended one of your classes on Tadabbur, and I found that was a very, very systematic approach that was very effective. Um, I tried that with my students, and it was a little bit too sophisticated for them, so I had to simplify the process of Tadabbur. So I think there's a basic approach to tadabbur where you train people to ask certain questions. Once they're used to asking certain questions for themselves and they're used to the idea of doing this self-audit, then they can go for a more advanced form of tadabbur, the way you teach in your classes with Academy Synergy. But at the most basic level, people have to be comfortable with this idea of asking questions. And this is probably the most difficult thing for a lot of people, because people assume that if you have questions in matters of religion, it's because you have doubts. And so I always start a semester with my students by saying, look, there are some questions that you ask because you doubt your religion. There are other questions that you ask because you want to improve yourself as a Muslim. So I will do a session where we will brainstorm questions together, and I will show them the kind of questions that they can ask in order um, to improve themselves and not ask the kind of questions that reflect doubts. Uh, I would say that one of the things that is probably useful here is you have to do this with people who are also themselves involved in tadabbur. So if you're doing it alone, it's a little bit difficult. But if you have a community of practice, it's a lot easier.
Mhm. So for this student, when they apply tadabbur, basically you simplify it by having them to watch video and to
Yeah.
get the point reflected on the
Yes.
video, right?
Yes. Correct.
Okay,
As
thank you.
as much as possible, I try to get them to watch videos in group,
Uh-huh.
because if they watch video alone, the danger is they have their own biases,
Mm.
and they don't realize that they have biases. They just think that they are good Muslims, but they don't become aware of their biases. When they are discussing in group, then individual biases can be eliminated through that group discussion.
Okay. Okay, we have a question online. Kindly elaborate on the system skill that is required in the Islamic management model. This
Okay.
is from whom? It is from Ahmad Badri, Dr. Ahmad Badri. So if you can enlighten us on it.
Okay, so systems thinking is a range of management techniques that was developed in the 1950s, 1960s. There's a very specific methodology. Um, one approach to systems thinking is called systems dynamics, which is very quantitative. There's another approach which is called systems thinking, which is more qualitative, more intuitive. The basic idea with systems thinking is you cannot just look at individual pieces of the problem. You need to look at the bigger picture. Okay, so what do I mean by that? When I used to work in the corporate sector, I used to do credit control. Credit control, if you want to reduce your level of bad debt, is very simple. You just don't give any credit to your customers. If you don't give any credit, you don't have any bad debts. If you look at sales, for sales to sell more, one of the easiest way for them to sell more is to give more credit to their customers. So if you're just looking at from the credit control perspective, you don't have the complete picture. If you're just looking at the sales perspective, you don't have the complete picture. So the systems thinking is you have this overall understanding how the organization work, and you find the right balances between the different departments. Okay, so there's a methodology which is, I would say, quite intuitive, and we have some experts in Malaysia actually who can deal with these problems. One of them is a friend of mine. His name is Hussein. I think Tuan Fazrul knows him as well. So you can either learn about systems thinking by reading books, or you can go through a process where you find the right consultant and you start working with that to solve very specific problems.
So, Dr. Ridhwan, when talking about the system thinking, can you give an example in Quran based on the chapter, the surah that you study, right? When you
Yeah.
write the book,
Yes.
one example on this idea of system thinking, if you can
Okay.
share with us.
So alhamdulillah, is a very interesting question. One of the events that was very traumatic in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ was the Battle of Uhud. And I think, as everybody knows, what happened during the Battle of Uhud is that there were 50 archers that were on a hill, and the Prophet ﷺ had told them very clearly, stay on this hill no matter what, you are protecting the back of the army. And the first beginning part of the battle was going very well, and so some of the archers decided to leave the ground, and this was the opportunity for Khalid ibn Walid to take the Meccans, come around the army of the Prophet ﷺ and create chaos, and almost it was almost a disaster for the Muslims. So a normal conventional approach to management will say, well, what's the big deal? I mean, there's 1,000 soldiers. If a few people leave the hill, it wouldn't make a difference. But in a systems thinking perspective, different parts of the army represent different parts of the system. If one part of the system, which is the archer, becomes weak, the entire system becomes very weak. Okay, so for me, this is one of the most obvious example of, if you have the right systems thinking, then you will avoid certain problems, and this is obviously in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I would argue, based on this, and of course the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam he never used the word system thinking, but when you look at the seerah, you say, for sure the Prophet ﷺ had an intuitive understanding of system thinking.
Mm-hmm. That is a good example. Interesting to know about that, to see anything in the system, right? Different angle, different perspective, so that we will come up into the conclusion. And yeah, we
So,
have another question
so
here.
maybe I can just add something.
Please.
For example, how would you relate to this in a corporate setting? When I meet, as much as possible, I try to meet people from the corporate sector, and when I meet someone, I always ask them, which department is your weakest department? Right? So some people will say maintenance, some people will say HR, some people will say sales, whatever department you identify as your weakest department, that's basically like the 50 archers on the battle of Uhud. That's the problem you have to solve first.
So interesting. So basically, if we go for a family or in any organization, um, relating to Surah Ali Imran, right? About the
Correct.
analysis of Uhud. So we
Yeah.
need to find the archer's archetype, right?
Correct.
In the
Correct. Correct.
organization to
And
improve the.
and it's very interesting to think about this. The archers were good Muslims. They
Yes.
were absolutely sincere. It's just they were given a responsibility and they didn't quite understand their responsibility. It could be as simple as the people who answer phone calls, at the office. There's a phone call or the phone that rings, and they're about to go home. I said, "Tapola." The customer will call tomorrow, and they just leave. And then that might have been the most important phone call for the business.
So in that case, if you can, yeah, we don't really go for the problem solving today, but at least how did Prophet manage this kind of people? We know the Uhud, the Muslim army get basically lost, right?
Yeah.
So how does it? How did the Prophet solve, and how to relate with the current situation?
Okay, so I'm going to say something. I don't know whether people will be upset or not, but my background is I was born in the UK and I worked in different multinationals in the UK and also in France. And one of the things that is very obvious in the Western context, there's two-way communication. So it's not just top management gives us instructions, is we share our opinion with top management. And top management spends a lot of effort telling us what's going on. So that even though you might be a low person inside the organization, maybe every 3 months the CEO will have like a town hall meeting and brief everybody so everybody knows what the strategy is, everybody knows what's the progress of the organization. Now, when you look at the leadership style of the Prophet ﷺ, he would do a lot of shura. And if you analyze the shura, most of the time, the Prophet ﷺ had already decided what he was going to do. But he wanted the Sahaba to fully understand what the strategy was. And there were some times when the Sahaba didn't quite understand what the Prophet ﷺ was trying to do. And so the shura wasn't really the Prophet also on brainstorming in order to make decisions, which is what most people assume that it was. It was more trying to create that everybody in the organization has the same perspective on what is the mission that needs to be achieved, right? And here you can see that sometimes the Prophet ﷺ was very flexible. So one of the interesting things with the Battle of Uhud is the Prophet ﷺ actually had decided to stay in Medina and fight in Medina. It was the Sahaba who persuaded him to fight on the Battle of Uhud. Now, the Prophet ﷺ could have used his authority to say, "Hey, I'm the Prophet. You should be following me." But the Prophet ﷺ was more interested in having everybody committed to the same plan rather than he has his plan and some of his Sahaba didn't quite, quote unquote, believe in his plan.
Thank you, Dr. Ridwan, to enlighten on how to the mechanism to get the group
Yeah.
together. It is more important to understand together using shura just now,
Yeah.
and
And
that is
two-way communication.
two-way communication basically.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question by by Nur Adina Amiza Yuswadi. It is not shown on the screen, but here is the question. Salam Dr. Ridhwan, are they conventional management theories that can be harmonized into Islamic management models so that we can slowly integrate the model into the corporate culture without it being too intimidating? Yeah, listening the way Tadabbur and Surah Al-Baqarah and so on and so forth. So how do you see it?
Okay, so it depends whether you're thinking at the organizational level or at the individual level. So at the organizational level, there are some theories of management which I definitely will recommend. So I'm a big fan of the work of someone called Peter Senji at MIT in the United States. And what he has done has been absolutely amazing and very easy to apply, very, very transformative. Unfortunately, not very well known in Malaysia. At the individual level, I always advise the work of I forgot his name. The guy who wrote about the 7 habits of successful. Yes, because really his model, even though it's very old now, is still, it works. And I have many times. So this is something I would like people to know. When I say something, I always say something because I've tested it with my students. So I've given some models to some of my students and it doesn't work. So I forget about them. Those models that I give to students and that works, I use them again and again and again. And I'm very confident about them because I've seen my students change once they start using these models.
Okay, so the model that you shared just now, integrating several concepts, is basically what works and not too intimidating, right?
Correct.
All right. We have another question here from, I just show it on the screen.
Yeah.
What are the major challenges in implementing Islamic management in mixed culture and resource environment?
Okay, Alhamdulillah. This is a very, very good question, a very smart question. So I started teaching in MMU, and I then started teaching in MSU. And the CEO and founder of MSU has got very strong Islamic values, but the lot of the MSU employees are not Muslims. And so what he always does is he talks about Islamic values, but he doesn't say these are Islamic values. He says these are universal values. So it's just a question of changing the language a little bit. But if you do that, people say, yeah, we can identify this because, again, we are so used to thinking about Islamic concepts. We can very easily change the language a little bit and say, hey, these are universal values. And everybody say, yeah, of course, we can recognize this.
So change the language to based on the concept in Islam, that will help, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. We have another question here by Rin I. Based on the short presentation, Islamic management is basically being a good Muslim?
Okay, so there are, I think it's more complicated than that. I think one of my very, very key findings was when I studied Surah Al-Baqarah. And Surah Al-Baqarah talks about leadership quite a lot. And so I argued I've written about these surahs and I've published these surahs in different academic journals. So one of the academic journals is associated with the International Islamic University. And in Surah Baqarah, what I argued is there's a lot of emphasis on leadership. And so I identified 3 types of corporate culture. A corporate culture that encourages the positive development of Muslims, a corporate culture that emphasizes the negative development sounds contradictory, but it's like it almost destroys the Islamic identity of employees. And the third is neutral. So, for example, I've worked in several organizations, for example, MMU, where it's a neutral corporate culture. No, the university didn't do anything to develop the identity of their staff. But in UIA, it's a very positive corporate culture. As an employee, you are really encouraged to become a better person. Okay. What I concluded is CEOs have got a moral responsibility. Muslim CEOs have got a moral responsibility to create a corporate culture that creates a positive change for their employees. I think for individual employees, they have, I would argue that they have the responsibility of working inside an organization that helps them keep their values, right? So if you're working in an organization where you have to do a lot of things that are haram, just as you're part of your everyday work, everybody can understand that that's a problem, right? And I always encourage people, if you're uncomfortable with the environment that you're working for, by all means, look for better opportunities, because the opportunities are there. There are so many good organizations that are trying to develop the Islamic identity of their employees. Some of them are very well known. Some of them are very small. I've met people, they've got 10, 15 people inside their organization, but they're very committed to developing these people. So, you have to find the right working environment for you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ridhwan, for answering the question. And we have more here. Could you please give an example and explain more on how to use Al-Fatiha in management in context? Maybe one or two examples. Yeah.
Okay, so alhamdulillah, I wrote an article about this, and I presented it in a conference about 6 months ago now. And one of the problems that I identified is abuse of power. So when you are a manager, you can very easily abuse your power. You can force your staff to do things that they're uncomfortable with. And very often the thing with abuse of power is you don't abuse your power consciously, right? The thing with power is the more power you have, the more you used to get power, and the more you take it as natural, and you start telling people to do things without realizing that it's something unethical. So when you are thinking about Surah Fatiha, and especially when you're in a management position, you should be thinking about how much power you have and whether you are discharging that power ethically or not. So, for example, in Surah Fatiha, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that there are three kinds of people. Some people are blessed, right? So I interpreted that as you are a Muslim manager and you use your power responsibility. Some people, they are mardub, right? They get the anger from other people, from the creation. Those are the Muslim managers. They know what is the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do, but they're using their power, they're abusing their power because they want to achieve the KPIs of the organization. And in Malaysia, there's a very common phrase where the boss say to you, do this. I don't care how you do it, just do it. Okay? That's a very dangerous thing to say, as everybody can understand. And then there's some Muslim managers who don't realize that what they're doing is unethical, right? So one of the issues that I talk a lot about in my book is the example of riba. Whether we like it or not, the Quran says very clearly, if you're involved in riba, you have declared war on Allah and His Messenger. If you're the CEO of a company and you just completely ignore that, there's a major problem in your understanding of what it means to be a Muslim.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ridhwan. To respond about one example or two about
Yeah,
in Surah Al-Fatihah, and I believe a
yeah.
lot of angle in Surah Al-Fatihah to be
Memang,
applied
memang.
in management, right? Because this is the
Yeah,
synopsis from 113 chapters in Quran. So of course, um, the every words in it will enlighten us on the management reality in our life.
Can I just share something?
Yeah.
Of all the surahs in the Quran, Surah Al-Fatiha was the surah that I took for granted. And
Mm-hmm.
in the process of writing this book, I have completely fallen in love with the surah again.
Okay.
And I cannot stress how important it is to do tadabbur of Surah Al-Fatiha.
Okay. So that's why in the content
Yeah,
of the for the book, I just take it from your draft. So
yeah,
basically, we talk about the opportunity, about management, about people, and overview of the history of ideas, and you had a reflection on Surah Al-Fatiha, right?
correct.
Mm-hmm. So this is Surah Al-Fatiha, Surah Al-Baqarah, Ali Imran, An-Nisa, Al-Ma'idah. So do you mean this is the chapters related to management, or basically throughout Quran has the angle, but you are just focusing these 5 chapters first in this book?
Okay, so what I decided to do, and this is after a lot of discussion with scholars in UAE, because alhamdulillah, this is one of the advantages of being associated with scholars, with UAE, is that I have easy access to very knowledgeable people. Um, I think what people have done in the past in the area of Islamic management is they try to take specific ayat and take them out of context. For me, that is very dangerous. And so what I decided to do is I'm looking at each surah as a whole and what is the benefit of that surah for a Muslim employee, whether he's in a senior management position or just a normal employee, doesn't matter. And then I'm trying to do as many surahs as I can. So for this volume, I've went up to Surah Al-Ma'idah, but I have planned a second and third volume. And by the end of the third volume, I come to the Surah Yusuf. Um, but actually, you can learn from every single surah in the Quran.
Okay, so basically every chapter of the surah has the understanding of Islamic management, right?
Correct.
Okay, final question. We have a lot, but I need to sort out. The final one is... Okay, let's have this. How to do self-audit as an individual and employee? How to balance it? Can
Okay,
you...
so whenever I do this, so first of all, I don't just do this with my students. I also do this for myself. I think you need to set a vision for yourself, whether it is individual, whether it is as an employee. I would say you should probably focus you as an individual first. And one of the things I realized is I had been learning about Islam for so many years. I mean, essentially, the day I converted to Islam was the day I started learning about Islam. But I only started studying the Quran seriously in 2015. So I was a Muslim for 22 years, reading books about this, that, whatever, but never really focusing on the Quran. So I think that the first thing to do is to really make a commitment to the Quran. Now, when I did it for myself, I started with Juz Amma. So just to get a good understanding of Juz Amma. And when I studied Juz Amma, it completely transformed my way of seeing the world around me. After I studied Juz Amma, I said, okay, I want to start from Surah Al-Fatiha, and I studied the whole Quran. Basically, I listened to the classes of Numan Ali Khan. He's got a website where he has the whole Quran in an explanation of the whole Quran. But I was not in a hurry to do this. So I would say start with, for example, Juz Amma. And if you feel that you become comfortable with the process, so for example, for me, it took some time for me to appreciate I needed to take notes. If I watched a video and I did some reflections without taking notes, after a while, I would lose the benefit. So I had to develop a methodology that I was comfortable with, that suit my lifestyle, my timetable, et cetera, et cetera. But once I was comfortable with doing Juz Amma, then I had the commitment to do the whole of the Quran by myself. Then when I started to get to know the Quran better, then I would interact with other people who were also interested in the Quran. And then I had something to talk about because at least I had some basic understanding, right? So it's almost, think about, you have a primary level or beginner's level, intermediate level, advanced level. So for sure, you have to start at the beginner's level. So when you are comfortable with having a beginner's understanding of the Quran, then only you can go to the intermediate level.
Thank you so much for to share how you did to get the idea about the individual audit just now, right? Self audit,
Correct.
and that is basically using Quran as a tool to as a manual, right?
Correct.
To open ourselves and basically in training in HR, one thing, we have so much literature from the West, right?
Correct.
And we have Quran. So do you think reading all those management technique from Harvard, from MIT, and so on and so forth, will be much more important, or Quran is a priority to every Muslim organization?
Okay, that's kind of a loaded question. So there are some management techniques which are very useful for, without any doubt. So for example, I absolutely believe in goal setting. I use a lot of time management techniques which comes from Western authors. So for me, it's not either or. But what you have to understand is every management technique is based on a secular philosophy. So the idea underlying all of this is secularism. So for example, one of the ideas which I have a lot of problem with is this idea that the goal of an organization is profit maximization. I completely disagree. Okay, you can maximize your profit as an organization and you are not achieving value for your customers. You're not achieving even your strategic objectives. So my understanding of Islamic management, for example, is your priority is on satisfying your customers. If your customers are happy, they will come back again and again and again and again, and eventually your profits will be there. It might be you're not maximizing your profits. It doesn't matter. Profit maximization is not a priority in Islamic management. What is a priority in Islamic management is to make sure your profit is halal. Okay, it's very easy to maximize your profit by cheating your customers. Companies do that all the time. But when you are really benefiting for your customers, you're really adding value to them. First of all, you as an employee, you feel very good about yourself. You're obviously, you have something to defend yourself on Yawm Qiyamah. But hopefully your customers will just, keep coming back and again and again and again, and they will be promoting your organization because they're really satisfied with what you're doing. So you have to be very careful with the philosophy that lies underneath management ideas. Some of them are actually completely contradictory with Islam. And
Okay,
that's one of the things I talk about at the beginning of the textbook.
okay. So basically, the theory, the idea from the West, from the management theory is okay, as long that we can screen it based on the right philosophy from Quran, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So we are in the end of the session, Dr. Ridhwan. So based on the table of content of your book,
Yeah,
today we are having introduction for Islamic management,
yeah,
and your book is basically done and under editing and to be published.
right.
So do you plan, besides teaching in UIA, do you plan to share the content online, especially when we have this PKP, the
Yeah,
restricted movement order, right? So
yeah,
it seems like to go to UIA is one option, but using internet right now,
yeah,
Facebook and YouTube get
correct.
your time for from time to time. Is it
Yeah.
possible, if anyone as audience would like to know deeper, what's your plan and how to share this in the future?
Okay, so um, my plan is very simple. Um, Before becoming an academic, I was working in the corporate world, and I worked for mostly multinationals, even though I've worked also in a very small organization in the past. Um, so at the end of the day, I always see the value of bringing things to the corporate world. And I think that there has to be a very dynamic and positive interaction between the corporate sector and the university sector. So definitely, I want to bring this to the corporate world. And my attitude is not, hey, look at me, I'm the expert, you should follow what I'm doing. My attitude is more, this is what I'm doing with my students. Let's see if this is going to work for you guys. And if it doesn't work exactly, how can we modify the model a little bit to make it work for you guys? Um, so definitely, I would like to do it, but the challenge, I think, will be how to make it a two-way communication, how to make it so I understand the context that people are working for. So, for example, I'm assuming that from one industry to another industry, it will be a completely different experience. So, in some industry, it'll be very easy, another industry will be very difficult. Okay, so for example, personally, I already believe that it'll be very easy to spread Islamic management in Sendiran Berhad. I think it will be quite difficult to spread Islamic management in publicly listed companies. I may be wrong. That's just my assumption. Okay, so this is where you have to be flexible, and so how to find the right platform. This is where I will hopefully rely on the expertise of Academy Synergy to help me figure this out.
Okay, thank you so much. Inshallah, at least what I'm thinking about is for those who are interested to dive deeper about this topic. There is a number on the screen, 013-964-6618. You can just text and we will keep updating the info based on the discussion with Dr.
Yeah,
Ridhwan, and perhaps we can have more sessions like this, maybe in terms of two-way communication rather than only between us. We can have like on Zoom, so people can uh, directly talk to you in a small group to handle maybe one sector or one genre, and then we move
yeah,
on and move on to see how it is applied in real life in industry, right? Inshallah.
yep, yep.
Okay, so last word from you, please, before we.
Uh, the obvious thing to say is Selamat berbuka puasa for everybody. So maybe something I didn't say is my wife is Malay. I've been living in Malaysia since 1999. So if people want to communicate to me in Malay, I have no problem. Inshallah, saya boleh cakap bahasa Melayu. Mungkin
Okay.
tak pandai tetapi boleh.
Okay, so maksudnya boleh cakap bahasa Melayu itu
Memang
menutup
boleh.
kita
Kan
pada.
awak tahu.
So kita menutup sesi kita ini dengan bahasa Melayu kita dan terima kasih diucapkan pada Dr. Ridhwan Fontaine untuk
Sama-sama.
berkongsi masa, berkongsi ilmu pada bulan Ramadan ini. Dan kita saya akan menyusun kembali dengan Dr. Ridhwan bagaimana kita akan lebih mendalami lagi, ya. Apatah lagi kita pada bulan diturunkan Al-Quran. Jadi ada surah Al-Fatihah, surah Baqarah, surah Ali Imran, Nisa dan Maidah yang telah ditulis oleh Dr. Ridhwan. Paling kurang ada 5 sesi, katakan satu sesi 1 jam. Dr. Ridhwan berkongsi surah Fatihah in management, surah Baqarah in management, surah Ali Imran in management. So kita ada 5 sesi. Itu idea saya. This is my idea. So if Dr. Ridhwan has the time and for the audience would like to have it to join, please let us know by the number given on the screen at the bottom, dan insyaAllah kita akan bertemu lagi pada masa akan datang. Terima kasih Dr. Ridhwan.
Okay, sama-sama.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.